Do you know that old expression, X walked so Y could run? Yeah, that applies to video games too. In fact, there are some systems that are so old and rare that you may not even know what they are, but the truth is that the home console systems we're going to discuss set the stage for the current industry behemoths that we know and love today. Let's start by talking about the so-called father of video games, the Magnavox Odyssey. The first Odyssey came out in September 1972 and was the first video game console ever available for home purchase. It was available for $99, which is more than $700 in today's value. The technical specifications of the system are beyond unrecognizable compared to what's on the market today. It could only display monochrome white shapes on a black screen, and a limited number at that. The system only allowed you to move one of 3 dots. There was no sound and certainly no music. The system was powered by 6C batteries, although you could purchase a power adapter. The Magnavox Odyssey came with 2 controllers. The controllers look like nothing that we'd use today. It has 3 knobs, one of which was located on top of the other. The knobs could be used to control the movement of the dots. However, later controllers would include a light rifle, kind of similar to the Nintendo Zapper. The games themselves weren't in cartridges the way we'd think of them. Instead, they were kind of these printed circuit boards. The circuit boards would then change the shape of the dots and the lines on the screen and alter how these dots would move. Early games included handball, soccer, submarine, and table tennis. You probably know table tennis. It was a forerunner of Pong. How primitive was this system? So, it actually came with paper money and dice that would work alongside the games because the system itself couldn't handle the additional features. Even better, in some cases, the system came with paper overlays that you could attach to your television, substituting for visual elements that the system was simply too primitive to generate. The Magnavox Odyssey was on the market from 1972 to 1975 and sold about 350,000 units. A pretty significant number when you consider that the Magnavox was essentially the pioneer for the entire market. You are probably familiar with the Atari 2600, the first massively commercially successful home video game console. Also the one, of course, that almost killed the entire industry with the video game crash of 1984, but that's a different story, and I swear one of these days that's a different video. Anyway, regardless, the 2600 wasn't the first home system that Atari actually sold. That was the Atari Home Pong. Let's go backwards for a second. Pong was an extremely successful video game first released in June 1972, around the same time as the Magnavox Odyssey. However, Pong was an arcade cabinet. It first made its way into a California bar, Andy Capp's Tavern, in August 1972, and was considered a major advancement on the traditional pinball games that were already on the market. The game was a massive commercial success, and Atari was able to manufacture game cabinets for bars, restaurants, and arcades. Seeking to capitalize on the success of Pong, and noting the success of the Magnavox Odyssey, Atari began to examine the possibility of releasing a Pong home system. The price of the system when it debuted, again around $99, $700 in today's dollars, scared off many realtors, but Sears eventually agreed, and the system was up for sale in the Christmas 1975 season. What makes this system's success even more remarkable, even by today's standards, is what the product contained. As you can see, it was extremely simple. You played the Pong using 2 knobs that are integrated into the system itself. And that's it. But the system flew off the shelves. Despite the high price, it sold more than 150,000 units and became one of Sears' most successful products to date. Atari would later produce an internal version of the console, and that sold another 50,000 units. All of this for a market that barely even existed at the time. The success of the Pong home system and the Magnavox Odyssey pushed the development of additional systems that would break more technological and commercial barriers. That included the Fairchild Channel F, which absolutely has one of the strangest names of any system I've reviewed. Incidentally, the F in Channel F stood for fun. Yeah, anyway. The Channel F was produced by Fairchild Camera and Instrument, a company that actually did a lot of photography business, including for the government. The system was developed by Wallace Kirshner and Lawrence Haskell, both of whom worked for Outplex Computer Corporation, and were trying to sell a video game system. They had no luck until the system was found by Fairchild engineer Jerry Lawson. So here's the thing. Kind of like the Magnavox Odyssey, the Fairchild wasn't really a massive commercial success, only selling 350,000 units. But that's remarkable, because the system adopted some of the conventions that are still widely used today by video game systems. First, the Channel F sold games and cartridges that could be purchased commercially. As you can see, these cartridges bear a pretty strong resemblance to the Nintendo cartridges that we still use. They could be inserted into the system and played accordingly. Next, the Channel F actually had something approximating a controller. This hand controller allowed players to move characters or cursors on the screen in 8 directions, a first for the time. Controllers were also removable and could be stored in a slot in the back of the machine. The button on the top of the controller could be pushed or pulled, allowing for players to engage in some sort of action. Honestly, for the time, the controller is ingenious. And finally, the system was the first of its kind to use color. The Odyssey and the Atari Pong were both black and white. Now, to be clear, the color is not anything like what we're used to today. 8 colors could be used in limited combinations, but for the time, this was still pretty impressive. The Channel 8 released 26 games, including Blackjack, Baseball, Robot War, and Video Whizball, which is the best title ever. Part of the reason that the Channel F failed was because it was an inferior system when compared to the Atari 2600, which it beat to the market. The 2600, as noted earlier, was the first massively successful home console system. It sold more than 30 million units, dwarfing the sales of the Channel F. Not helping anything was the price of the Channel F. The system went for $169, which is the equivalent of $910 today. Yikes. The release of the 2600 ultimately doomed the Channel F, which was discontinued in 1983. However, that's not to say that other systems didn't make a solid run at the 2600. Meet the Coleco Telstar, and the Coleco Telstar Classic, and the Alpha, and the Ranger. Wait, what? Yeah, the Coleco Telstar was notable in that in between 1976 and 1978, 14 different models came out. In addition to the 4 I mentioned, there was also the Colormatic, the Combat, yes, that's with an exclamation mark, and the Colortron. So why were there so many different systems? Well, they all came with different features. As you can see, different systems looked really different. The control scheme was different as well. Some had knobs, some had fixed joysticks, this one had a steering wheel and a gun, you get the idea. The different systems also had different games that were preloaded. For example, the first system, the Telstar, came only with hockey, handball, and tennis. All games were basically variations of Pong. More advanced systems, like the Combat, came out with other games, including Night Battle and Robot Battle. It wasn't until the arcade came out that Coleco figured they had to take advantage of the cartridge model. Only 4 cartridges were ever produced, and they sold at $25 a game. This might sound wildly inefficient, expensive, and useless from a marketing perspective. And, well, that's correct. But it's also a reflection of the uncertainty surrounding the home console market at the time. Consoles and other form of removable media weren't quite as popular yet, and video game systems weren't sure which direction they were going. The Coleco Telstar, and its more than a dozen models, bet that the industry would sell different systems that came preloaded with different games. It's a bet they got wrong, but it's also a bet that made them really unique. No other home console system came with this many options. Now, to be clear, it wasn't a total flop. The Coleco Telstar, the base model, sold more than 1 million units. However, it wasn't built to last. The lack of programmable cartridges meant that no other games could be sold on the system until the advent of the Coleco Arcade, but by then it was way too late. The Atari 2600 made its North American premiere in September 1977, around the same time that most of these Coleco models were hitting the street. The company would switch to making games before coming back to the home console market in 1982 with the ColecoVision. That didn't work, and the company was defunct by 1989. Speaking of unique cartridge designs, meet the Intellivision, produced by Mattel. This second-generation console system represented a real threat to the Atari 2600's dominance of the video game market at the time, as it actually had better graphics and sound. In fact, the system sold more than 3 million units before it was discontinued. What made the system different was multifaceted. First, it was relatively technologically advanced at the time. It ran on 4K of ROM and had a highly flexible technological infrastructure that allowed for easy coding and game creation. One slogan for the system was "the closest thing to the real thing," and the system was often marketed for its realism rather than as a children's toy. This helped it to gain a very different market position than some of its competitors, including the 2600. Adding to this reality was this weirdo thing, its controller. There are 12 buttons, a 0 through 9 numerical keyboard, and a clear and enter button, as well as 2 buttons on each side of the controller. The directional pad acted like a joystick that could move in 16 different directions, which was very advanced for the time. Different games also had plastic overlays that could show players how to use different buttons for different functions. Then there was this, the keyboard. The system itself was advertised as the quote master component, and this guy here was the quote keyboard component. The addition of the keyboard allowed Intellivision to run pre-programmed software. It even came with a microphone and cassette port, with a printer eventually sold. There were plans to sell the Intellivision with a modem, although those never came to fruition. Repeated manufacturing delays meant that only 4,000 keyboard units were ever sold. So the keyboard was deeply ambitious, and to be honest, that fits with the entire model of the Intellivision, which also sought to expand into a entertainment computer system, a voice add-on, and more. I mention these to prove a bigger point. For those of you of my generation, you may remember that it was a little revolutionary when the Xbox and the PlayStation expanded so that you could play DVDs on the system. At the time, this was a very big deal because video game systems were trying to do more. That's why the Intellivision was more than just a video game system. It was a component of a larger whole. However, the Intellivision was ultimately eclipsed by newer Atari systems. Then came the rise of personal computers, and Mattel couldn't compete. Despite having as much as 20% of the domestic video game market in 1982, by 1984 the system was essentially gone. Now, that's not to say that Mattel completely failed when it came to entertainment consoles. All of the consoles that we reviewed so far were home systems. They were big and clunky. Mattel's Auto Race took the world in a very different direction, as this was the first ever handheld video game. This game, which came out in 1976, was relatively simple. Players controlled a car and moved it between one of 3 lanes, trying to work their way to the top of the screen 4 times without hitting the dots. They had to do so before a 99-second timer ran out. A side gear allowed you to control the speed of the car. The gameplay was simple, but also revolutionary. Never before was an electronic game capable of being carried in your pocket. The game was a side project of George Klaus, an engineer for Mattel who was using spare calculator parts. The game's programming language fit into just 512 bytes of ROM. The system sold at $25 a game and was a massive hit. It was such a hit that it led to Mattel Football, which sold even better and paved the way for the future handheld electronics market. So, why did I do this video? Why bother covering video games that are older than me and maybe older than some of your parents, young whippersnappers? Well, a few reasons. First, I think it's critical that we realize how far we've come. Advanced systems used to have paddles. Now there are video games you can control with your mind. You get spoiled if you don't follow the path of history, even video game history. Second, I wanted to prove a bigger point. Video games are all connected. The Odyssey crawled so Nintendo could walk. The Channel F made games in color and was the first to use cartridges. The Mattel Auto Race paved the way for the Switch. All of the systems we know and love today didn't develop in isolation. They had their roots in systems that are generations removed. And that history deserves to be remembered, celebrated, and learned from. It's in the success and failure of video games in the past that we can find a way to better systems and better games, and avoid repeating old mistakes. And that's all I got for this one. I hope you enjoyed this video, and please subscribe if you did. Hit the like button, leave a comment below, and let me know what you think. When you do those things, it helps boost the video in the algorithm, and yeah, that's a big help. And thank you, friends. As always, have a wonderful day out there. We'll see you soon.